Good evening, everybody. Hi, I'm Nathan Cogan, and I want to welcome all of you here tonight, and I must say how thrilled I am to see so many folk here and good friends from my past. It's really a joy. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to bring Michelle Goldberg to Portland and to Portland State University under the auspices and support of a lectureship which I started in 2007, the year after the death of my late wife, Sara Glasgow Cogan. First off, I'm very pleased that so many of you came this evening, in the rain, of course, too, to join us on this significant occasion. I wish to acknowledge Danielle Cogan, my daughter-in-law, who agreed both to speak about Sara Glasgow Cogan's life and to introduce Michelle. Equally important, Danielle, Judy Margold's CEO of the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education, David Fuchs, who could not be here this evening, Rachel Pollack, who has joined us, and Bob Liebman, who's away, have worked on the Speakers Selection Committee for some time and have, over the last several years, brought such distinguished speakers as Professor Timothy Snyder in the History Department at Yale and Professor Daniel Ziblatt in the government program at Harvard. They have come to this forum in a line of really unusually great folk. I also wish to recognize Holly Irons. If you would just wave to the crowd a little bit. There you are. Holly was the Sara Glasgow Cogan intern student from Portland State and from Judaic Studies, working at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education during the period 21-22. And it's always a joy to have one or two students each year participating in the internship named after Sara. I'm going to make this short. In the evolution of this series, special credit must be given to our program coordinator, Andrea Jonda, in history. Will you kindly wave wherever you are? There you are. Program coordinator is rather slight. She's the manager, she's the boss, she's the supervisor, she's the one that has been corresponding to Michelle and working out all the details from the sound folk, the folk here at Portland State who have to put chairs and stuff together. But she has been extraordinarily helpful to the program. Her attention to details has been so important. Now, others who have been helpful include my three sons, David, Jonathan, and Daniel. And Daniel is here tonight. If you would just wave, that would be helpful. My brother-in-law, Bob Glasgow, and his wife, Leslie, and Professor Marie Lowe. Some folk are not here tonight for a range of reasons, but Marie has been in the English department and worked with me on several projects these last several years. Other community folk who have supported this important event include the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, the Oregon Jewish Museum, Natan Meir, and PSU's Judaic Studies program. Natan, are you sitting somewhere here? There he is. Cy Adler with Urban Studies. I believe he is the acting provost. If anybody knows his exact title, help me out. Jonathan Levine with UBS here in Portland has been most helpful as a contributor, John Lochting with State Farm, and not least, Tara Siegman with the Oregon Jewish Community Foundation. I now welcome to the stage Professor Susan Jeffords, sometimes referred to as Dr. Susan Jeffords, who is currently the provost of Portland State University, and she is going to give us some remarks. Thank you.
Well, welcome all of you on this rainy Portland evening. Wait, did I just say rainy in Portland in the same sentence? Sorry, it's redundant. It's rainy and it's Portland, but thank you all for coming out this evening. I especially want to acknowledge and recognize the Cogan family for making possible this lecture this evening in honor of Sara Glasgow Cogan. And I want to really give a round of applause to the entire family for supporting events such as this. I'm truly honored to be part of the process that introduces tonight's speaker. You'll have to wait a minute because I don't actually introduce the speaker. I introduce the person who introduces the speaker. So you'll have to be a little patient, but I'm honored to be part of this process because I will say, Michelle, I'm a huge fan. I read your column every time I see it in the New York Times, and it's one of my favorite reads, and so it's just a wonderful pleasure to have you here this evening. But I also have to say, Michelle, autocracy and anti-feminism, you really only needed the first word, right? Because embedded in autocracy is anti-feminism. And as a feminist scholar myself, I've spent my career writing about feminism, masculinity, and anti-feminism. So I am truly riveted by what you're saying. I know that you commented a few minutes ago that you picked this title before we knew how relevant the title would be. And at the same time, I want to say, all of us women, we kind of knew anyway, didn't we? But the stories in the news that we're seeing right now make your topic so relevant, so important, so impactful, that it's something that we all need to attend to. Whether it's the impact on women in this country of the Dobbs decision, whether it's the protests that we're seeing in Iran because of the incredible bravery of Iranian women who are standing up and removing their headscarves in honor of Mahsa Amini, whether it is protests that we're seeing all around the world from women who are understanding what's happening as a result of autocratic regimes or proto-autocratic regimes. This topic couldn't be more timely, more important, and more relevant. And I thank you, Michelle, for bringing this to the surface and for talking about this issue and making sure that we don't neglect this issue and neglect the impact that this topic has on women and men all over the world. So I really appreciate that you're here and that you're making visible this conversation this evening. So I'm honored to have you here at Portland State, where of course we value these topics, we value the dialogue, we value the opportunity to have open conversations. This is what universities in this country stand for, this is what we do. We promote dialogue, we promote open conversation, open debate around key issues. And so in many ways, Michelle, you honor and represent what American higher education stands for. But I'm not going to stand any farther in the way of getting to the important content of our talk this evening, but I will recognize Danielle Cogan, who is going to take a more direct opportunity to introduce our speaker. Danielle?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight on this very rainy, classically Portland evening after our fires and the immense heat. So, hello, my name is Danielle Pacifico Cogan, and I am one of Sara Cogan's daughters-in-law. And on behalf of the Cogans who are not here, and some of whom who are here, like Sara's oldest grandchild, her granddaughter, Katie Cogan. Katie, will you raise your hand, please, so we can see you? The pride and joy of Sara's life, and her son Daniel, who has already been forced to raise his hand. You don't have to do it again. And her niece, Barbara Cogan-Neidig, and of course, Sara's beloved brother and partner in crime, Bob Glasgow, and her beloved sister-in-law, Leslie Veltman Glasgow, who are here today. And I'd also like to acknowledge Sara's friends who are here, because Sara, I am not Jewish by birth. I'm Jewish by association and culture. And Sara, she was a macher, right? Is that the right word? I think is the right word. And a lot of her girls are here tonight and a lot of her boys, but I wanted to acknowledge her friends who are here. Selma Duckler, Gary and Judy Kahn, who she knew since like 3rd grade, has been her girl forever and ever. Sandra and Gordon Perlman, Jay Margulies, Susie Danielson, and I just wanted to say that and put that into the room because they were her lifelong friends. And Judy Margles, of course. And with that, I will move on to the introduction. But what I'd like to say is that Sara Cogan would have loved this lecture in her honor, and she would have loved Michelle Goldberg. And anybody who knew Sara Cogan knows that is the truth. Sara was a fierce champion for women's rights from her time as a young girl, but I probably shouldn't call it that, but when she started at Mills College in Oakland, California, to her professional life. And her late sister-in-law, one of Nathan's triplets, his fellow triplets, Ann Orkin, the late Ann Orkin once said and recounted to me in conversation that in 1963, Sara called her and said, "I've read the greatest book that's ever been written. It's going to change the world." And that book was The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. And so that tells you a little bit about who Sara was as a person. And Sara was the mother of 3 boys, all very accomplished, all very thoughtful, all very politically engaged, and they all married 3 very different and very strong, outspoken women. So the effect was made. And she was always a seeker and a thinker and so inquisitive, and she made a mark in this community. And this is the thing that's unfortunate, is that when Sara Cogan passed away in 2006, the world was definitely a different place. George W. Bush was president, Harry Reid was the Senate Majority Leader, and Dennis Hastert was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And today, you will see my bias in the way that I express this. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. is the President of the United States of America. Kamala Devi Harris is the Vice President of the United States of America and the tiebreaker in the US Senate. And Nancy D'Alessandro Pelosi of Baltimore, Maryland is the Speaker of the House. But one thing that remains the same and hasn't changed is that women's fundamental rights are under attack. And our very basic rights of control over our own bodies is still contested. And for some women in this country, it is dire, and for others it is still dire, but they don't see how dire it is because their rights have not been challenged as far as they've known. But that's why we're here tonight, to hear from the brilliant, the thoughtful, the very kind, and the very patient, trust me, she had to listen to all of us talk at her for an hour, Michelle Goldberg from the New York Times and MSNBC. And she's going to talk to us about the connection between the systemic erosion of our increasingly fragile democracy and the rollback of women's rights. So thank you all for being here, and please welcome the esteemed Michelle Goldberg. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much for coming out. It's really an honor to be here. So because the midterms are 2 weeks away, I'm going to start by talking about Herschel Walker. Sorry. But before I do that, I just want to put in context, I think, what's happening in Georgia right now. It's useful to remember what happened in Georgia a couple of years ago. I know this is not a partisan event. I know from talking to some of you that you share my dismay at the political trends in this country. And after the 2016 election, I was in such a dark place. I'm probably not the only one. And I remember feeling some respite I went to Washington to cover the inauguration, the protests around the inauguration, and there was this sense the day after the inauguration, you just kind of felt like the cavalry is coming. You saw all these people pouring into the city, all these women pouring into the city in this protest movement that was, I think, until the Black Lives Matter protests a few years later, was the biggest protest movement this country has ever seen, at least for a single day. And, that was a kind of intimation that something was stirring. And then there was, you might remember, an off-year special election in the Georgia 6th District because the sitting congressman had joined the Trump administration. And so, there was a lot of excitement. There was this young candidate named Jon Ossoff, and I remember going down there and emailing friends of mine and saying, I have never seen anything like this, because there were so many women in the Georgia suburbs who had not been political, who voted most years, maybe didn't know who their state senator was, kind of vaguely knew who their member of Congress were, who right after Donald Trump was elected, it was like a switch was flipped, and suddenly politics became their entire lives, and all of this energy that they had poured into the PTA was suddenly being poured into being, precinct captain, and all of the local knowledge that they had developed as members of their community and mothers was suddenly being harnessed for the midterms. And it was, I think, you could see then the beginning of this kind of wave that would build in 2018 and that would eventually help sweep Donald Trump out of office. But I think often when you see, kind of any movement for social progress in this country, and certainly when you've seen women's movements, not just in this country, but all around the world, there's always a backlash. And we're in the middle of a really fierce one, although I don't think we yet know just how ferocious it's going to be. Which brings me to Herschel Walker. Now, I think that it doesn't surprise me or even really scandalize me that Herschel Walker still has such robust support, not just after paying for an abortion by the woman who later gave birth to one of his children, even as he wants to ban all abortion. I don't, if you've reported on, or if you've been around the reproductive rights movement, people who work at clinics sometimes have a saying, which is that everyone believes in 3 abortion exceptions: rape, incest, and me. And Herschel Walker believes in one of those exceptions. And that's not that surprising. It's not even that surprising to me that so many voters and so much of the movement have stuck with him when the news of him holding a gun to the head of his ex-wife came out. I think if you're a Democrat, it's worth thinking about what we would do or what you would do in a similar situation, right? If there was a candidate who, kind of was similarly abusive, similarly dissociative, would you still vote for them if it meant keeping Mitch McConnell from becoming Senate Majority Leader? And making sure that there's not going to be any more confirmations for the next 2 years? I think you could make a decent moral case that that's the right thing to do. And so I think from a lot of Republicans' perspective, there's a perfectly kind of rational reason to vote for Herschel Walker that's, consonant with the political beliefs that they say they hold. What I think is very different, and what I don't think I could imagine happening on the other side, is the enthusiasm for Herschel Walker. Some of you might know that when the news broke that he had paid for this abortion, he had one of his biggest fundraising days ever. He went to a church and people laid hands on him and they celebrated him. And, so this is something that's kind of quite different than what happened with Donald Trump after the famous Access Hollywood tape came out, where there was kind of shame and people and kind of a rush to distance. And even the people who said they still had to support Donald Trump in general did it with some sort of hesitation. And that hesitation is gone now, because I think that what Donald Trump showed is that there is no price to be paid, at least among his own supporters, at least among this movement, at least among, I think, kind of nascent authoritarians. There is no price to be paid for, the kind of most flagrant immorality. And I think it's important to not see this as hypocrisy. I don't think it is hypocrisy. I actually think that you have a movement that is living out its values, and what it values is the restoration of hierarchy. What it values is the restoration of male prerogatives. There was this quote from Dana Loesch. I don't know if you know who she is. She's a very prominent right-wing activist, a very prominent gun rights activist, and she said, if the story is true, you're telling me Walker used his money to reportedly pay some skank for an abortion. And Warnock wants to use all of our money to pay a whole bunch of skanks for abortions. And then she said, it doesn't change anything for me. I don't care if he did it or not. I don't even care. And so I think this tells us a couple of things about the, movement that may be about to take control of the House of Representatives. One, I think that this movement really does find abortion an abomination, but they don't consider it murder. If you really believe that Herschel Walker was a party to a homicide, you are not going to behave with such kind of blithe unconcern. I think that there is a real horror of abortion because of what abortion means for women's place in the world, for the order between the sexes. And there are clearly people in the anti-abortion movement who really do feel this incredible compassion for the fetus. I think it's, there are certainly people in the anti-abortion movement who actually do think that it's murder, but they're not the people who are in control. They're not the people who are passing laws, and they're not the people who are going to have women actually prosecuted for murder. I think if you can't think of a clearer exposition of the fact that what we're talking about is really a kind of a restoration of men's power over women. The other thing that I think it shows us is that even though the right doesn't consider abortion murder, they do have a sort of a vision of the world. They do have, kind of a metaphysics. They do have a set of values that they want to impose on the rest of us. There's a vision of the world in which there are fundamental hierarchies of gender, of race. There are fundamental hierarchies of the way kind of societies are organized. There are certain men who should be able to exercise authority over their families, their communities, their schools. The people who submit happily to that authority are within a sort of blessed circle of protection, and the people who do not enjoy the same rights as other citizens. There's a quote that maybe some of you have heard that I think is really useful in understanding the current state of the conservative movement. It's by a guy named Frank Williott. And what's so tricky about this quote is that there is a Frank Williott who is a political scientist, and that's not the person that this quote is from. This is actually from, oddly enough, a classical music conductor. But he said, conservatism consists of exactly one proposition. There must be in-groups whom the law protects but does not bind, alongside out-groups whom the law binds but does not protect. Now, this formulation holds true in lots of different ways. It's obviously, I think, a prism through which we can understand race and policing. If you look at the right's reaction to the detention of the January 6 protesters, the kind of horror at the prison conditions in which some of them are being kept, a kind of horror that doesn't really extend to anyone else in the prison system. You can see, you know, the way the belief is not in kind of criminal justice reform. The kind of the outrage is about who is a proper subject of the criminal justice system. You can see it in, you know, kind of class and questions about who deserves help from the government and who does not, you know, who deserves to work and who deserves to rest. And I'm going to talk about how it functions with gender, both because I've been writing about reproductive rights and women's rights for many years, and I've been writing about far-right politics for a long time. And these two things have sort of come to intersect at this moment. And I also think that the interaction between gender and authoritarianism, although on the one hand, as Susan said, you know, in some ways Susan just kind of summed up my lecture when she said you don't need the second word, right? That anti-feminism is contained within authoritarianism. It's a kind of necessary precondition for it. It's an inevitable part of it. But at the same time, the connection can sometimes be really subtle because women aren't really an outgroup, although large groups of women certainly are. And I think a lot of, you know, the kind of work of the modern right is deciding, you know, which kind of women deserve the protection of citizenship and which do not. So I think we probably all know that there is a connection between anti-feminism and right-wing populism, not just in this country, but in basically every country. You can see it, as Susan said, most starkly on the streets of Iran, where, you know, you have these women defying these fascist clerics and their enforcers and chanting, you know, women, life, freedom. But this is something that you see in kind of almost every authoritarian state to one degree or another. Some of them, and I think the newer kind of right-wing populist regimes are where you see this elevated kind of swaggering misogyny and contempt for women. So we probably all know that, you know, Vladimir Putin has fashioned himself as this icon of kind of macho manhood, this defender of traditional values and the traditional family against the decadence of the West. You know, a few years ago, he passed a law that decriminalized most forms of domestic violence. You know, one of the first signs, I think, of the kind of leader that he would turn out to be was his targeting of the LGBT community, of sexual minorities in Russia. You know, it was the canary in the coal mine for, you know, a sort of monomania that now is threatening large parts of the world. And I think it's worth thinking about that when we see, you know, kind of similar canaries dying here. So years ago, I wrote a book about the global battle over reproductive rights, and I traveled all over the world. And at the time, I was thinking a lot about the way the American right was exporting itself. It was, you know, both kind of directly by, you know, either when George W. Bush was in power, by using the power of the government to pressure other countries not to liberalize their abortion laws, by siding with regimes like Iran, you know, like Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, the Vatican, in order to kind of fight reproductive rights and fight women's rights at the international level, but also the sort of seeding of right-wing organizations all over the world, so that suddenly you would start seeing American-style anti-abortion protests in, you know, Addis Ababa. And one giveaway about, you know, kind of where this was coming from was that the signs would often be in English. So while I was reporting that book, I went to a conference. It was in Warsaw that year. It's in different countries every year. It was called the World Congress of Families. And the World Congress of Families is a project that brings together, basically, it was the sort of initial germ of what I think is now a much more sprawling movement of kind of a world. I mean, it's kind of ironic in that it's like this global alliance of anti-globalists. It's this, kind of international alliance of anti-cosmopolitans, but it's, so kind of, populist, religious right figures from many different countries. There was at the time a sort of belief, there was some tentative and ambivalent efforts to bring together Islamic fundamentalists and Christian fundamentalists, although that obviously had sort of run aground on the debates over the war on terror. But there was some of that and some cooperation at the international level, but also people from Latin America, people from sub-Saharan Africa, and many people from Russia and people linked to the Russian government. And I think, at the time, I don't know that I really understood what that meant, because I think I was still thinking actually in a somewhat provincial way about America exporting its conservatism. I wasn't really thinking about Russia exporting its conservatism and how Russia had kind of had a foreign policy at the time of, cultivating right-wing figures throughout the world and kind of setting itself up, like I said, as this defender of faith against, a kind of depraved secular West. I later found out that the World Congress of Families was actually founded by a right-wing American historian, but also a Russian sociologist, and it would soon come to have, significant support from a couple of Russian oligarchs. So it was this early sign that, that the kind of far right was getting globalized. And, now we see that everywhere. We see Orban from Hungary, coming here and being lauded as if he was, the sort of, as if he were an adjunct of the Republican Party. You see, Bolsonaro in Brazil being hailed as, the kind of Latin American Donald Trump. Bolsonaro, for those of you who don't know, who is shortly going into a runoff, told a woman lawmaker that she didn't deserve to be raped. He said that he wouldn't pay men and women the same because of all the, because women have all sorts of kind of special rights in the workplace, like maternity leave. And he dedicated his vote to his predecessor was a woman named Dilma Rousseff. When she was impeached in 2016, he dedicated his vote to the colonel who had overseen her torture under the military government. This is someone who's become, a hero to much of the modern right, who has the enthusiastic support of Donald Trump. And in some ways, this is kind of easy to understand. If the populist right is a reaction to the kind of dislocations of modernity, well, one of the clearest and most obvious signs of modernity is gender equality. Margaret Mead has written that kind of every known society has at its core, at the kind of core of its culture, the gender binary. I think that that's probably an exaggeration and that people have probably discovered a lot of societies that have more fluidity since then. But I think as a generalization, it's been true that there have been, if you read kind of her work and the work of other anthropologists, you see how malleable this is, how qualities that in one society are seen as quintessentially male and in another society are seen as quintessentially female. So it's not that there's something kind of natural about the way that the binary is constructed, but the idea that sort of men and women have different roles is something that you see in most human cultures. And the idea that men and women should have the same roles, should have the same rights, that, sort of that people's path in life should be determined more by, their own desires and interests and skills and human flourishing, as opposed to these, inherited traits. That is the sort of essence of modernity, right? And it is not surprising that that is something that kind of any reactionary revanchist movement would immediately take aim at. And so all over the world, you see, it's a reassertion of this, kind of synthetic, ugly caricature of tradition in the name of, kind of overcoming a feminized modernity. But this really brutal, kind of swaggering, misogynistic populism is only one piece of what we're seeing, because, of course, a lot of right-wing populist leaders, and a growing number in this country, are women. There's Giorgia Meloni in Italy, Marine Le Pen in France, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is likely, according to recent reporting, to have kind of a major role in the next Congress if Republicans are able to take back that chamber. There is Carrie Lake, who could well become the next governor of Arizona, and who is, besides a ferocious election denier, is also somebody who wants to ban all abortion and ban the abortion pill, and is a kind of enthusiastic peddler of various conspiracy theories. And these figures obviously don't present themselves as embodying the kind of restoration of male privilege, but they do present themselves as kind of icons of like a decent womanhood, as opposed to whining or dissatisfied feminists. It's common for them, I think, to say that they have, well, I've never encountered any sort of sexism, and, I'm strong enough to rise on my own. Why can't all women be strong enough? It's common for them to fashion themselves as, sort of mama bear figures, and to, make sort of motherhood and the protection of motherhood the center of their political identity. And the reason that they're not threatening to the far right, although, in some places they are. Duterte in the Philippines, I think his daughter at one point was seen as a likely successor to him, until he basically said, no, a woman can't be a leader, and she withdrew her political ambitions, although I think she's running for vice president instead. So these women do they kind of legitimate the existing order, but they also soften it. They sort of complicate the idea that what the right is trying to do is just, kind of reimpose something, this kind of regressive traditionalism. And what they do, I think, often very skillfully, although they're not the only ones who do it, is that they're able to disavow feminism in almost every case, but invoke it in order to kind of demonize certain outgroups. So I think one of the clearest examples of this is the way, Marine Le Pen only talks about feminism when she's talking about protecting women from Muslim immigration, from when she's talking about, say, there was a really tragic incident in Cologne after Angela Merkel opened the borders and said, these people can, all these refugees can come into Germany. And it was, I think, one of the kind of great moments certainly in her reign, but also in just, kind of a European idea of kind of, this redemptive decency, especially in Germany. And then there was a backlash after there was this kind of gangs of men attacking women at a New Year's Eve celebration in Cologne that became a talking point for the right all over the world, including in this country. And, it was a real thing that happened. And so often with these stories that kind of that take on a mythological status, there's a grain of truth there. That's why they work. But it becomes so distorted into something that it becomes wildly distorted and used to demonize huge swaths of people. And so you saw that all over Europe with Muslim immigration. You frequently saw kind of right-wing people who are otherwise, champions of modesty and chastity, championing women's right to wear bikinis, and certainly women have rights to wear bikinis, although that's not perhaps the essence of feminism. And we're seeing it here in a different way. There's some of that with Muslim immigration. You hear a little bit of it. Donald Trump, talked about it a lot. But, we don't have the same kind of immigration, and it's just not as much of a live issue for a lot of people. So I think where you see it here is with trans girls in sports. You hear, and I actually think that, there are some, I think, really difficult debates about advantages that people who have gone through male puberty might have in certain sports. Like, I think those are real, and part of what's so difficult about having any of those discussions is that there is so much bad faith, and kind of trans people are under such sustained attack that it feels almost cruel to engage in those debates. And then I had this conversation not long ago with Marcy Bowers, who is the incoming president of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. She's a trans woman, a person who does a lot of gender confirmation surgeries, and who was saying that there actually, there are a lot of debates within the field that don't get aired because people are so protective and so defensive. There's debates about when is the right age to begin a transition. There are debates about how you balance kind of medical gatekeeping with the sort of need to make sure, especially adolescents, don't do anything rash. Like, these are live debates that people who work in this field are having, and that people are afraid to have them in public, again, because I think trans people are so under siege. So I'm not trying to suggest that kind of anybody who has any qualms about any of these issues, or not just qualms, anyone who has any questions is part of the far right. But I do think it's important to know that, just as there were people who had, some legitimate concerns maybe about how people from kind of patriarchal cultures would integrate into Europe, but there was also just a ferocious amount of anti-Muslim demagoguing and scapegoating. And we're seeing something similar with trans people. There is, right now, just as kind of abortion doctors have been targeted in the past, doctors who work on gender confirming care for young people, they're being targeted with death threats, with bomb threats, with protests outside their clinics, with state-level bans. And often what you have are people like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Carrie Lake or some of these other, kind of female figures saying that, well, we need protection. We need to defend the honor of women's sports and women's spaces, people who've certainly never expressed any sort of interest before in the future of Title IX. And the way it functions, I think, it functions very similarly. It's extremely effective. It's one reason why you have such, I think, a surge in right-wing energy right now, and why so many kind of liberals and people who believe in gender equality feel so much on the back foot, because these are very primal things. These are very primal anxieties that they are able to tap into. These are kind of very fundamental changes in the way that society organizes itself that create a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear. And that fear is really feeding this, kind of growing movement, a movement that we all saw We saw what it looked like on January 6th, and I think you can see it if you're out, those of us who are out reporting, those, kind of closely follow the news, you can sort of see it gathering steam all through the country. I often say that I feel like, we're in the kind of eye of the storm right now. So there's a kind of a calm, a normality, a sense that, yes, Joseph Robinette Biden and Kamala Harris and Nancy Pelosi are in charge, and the, insanity of the last few years has subsided a bit. I think that's really just for now. Now, what this kind of language of like protecting women, it's useful when you're thinking about this. I think people who study sexism and kind of study, misogyny and anti-feminist movements will sometimes talk about the difference between benevolent sexism and hostile sexism. And they don't really mean that benevolent sexism is benevolent, but it kind of speaks the language of benevolence. It's about protecting women. It's not about it's about kind of elevating women. It's about elevating motherhood, protecting chastity, it presumes to put women on a pedestal even as it sort of demeans them. Hostile sexism is holding a gun to a woman's head. Hostile sexism is, Nick Fuentes, a kind of up-and-coming star on the far right, saying that we need to repeal the 19th Amendment, and that, and him still having a place at least on the fringes of the Republican Party. And what you see, I think, is a sort of, especially in the anti-abortion movement, is kind of slippage, a slipping back and forth between the benevolent sexism of abortion hurts women, which is the official line, and the hostile sexism of we need to lock women up, lock her up being the, signature chant of the American incarnation of this movement. So some of you might remember during the 2016 election, or during the 2016 presidential campaign, when Donald Trump said, somebody asked him, what would you do with women who have abortions? And he said, well, there has to be some kind of punishment. And in some ways, that was a sort of frank and direct answer, because if you really believe, if you're really going to classify abortion as murder, then you're basically saying that huge numbers of women in this country are murderers, and it's kind of your obligation to treat them as such. But that's really an unpopular position. And so the anti-abortion movement has squared that by saying that, no, abortion hurts women. Women are victims of abortion. And so we're going to lock up doctors, but we're not going to lock up people who have abortions. Now, in practice, that's not really been the case. What we've seen historically is that there's been a number of laws in this country that have been passed to give kind of personhood rights to the fetus. They were passed in order to erode the legal foundation of Roe versus Wade, or in order to erode the legal foundation of kind of other laws protecting abortion rights. They were usually passed under the guise of protecting women. So for example, a woman would, in one state, I believe it was Indiana, a pregnant woman was shot. She, lost the fetus, and the law was passed to protect someone like that, to make sure that the person who had shot her was punished, not just for his assault on her, but for his assault on the child that she wanted to have. In practice, what these laws do is put women in jail. So, it's even before the Dobbs decision, there was women in America going to prison for ending their pregnancies. They were either women who had self-aborted, they were women who had miscarriages under ambiguous circumstances, women who did drugs and then had a miscarriage where the drugs may or may not have been responsible. So this was something that was happening already. And now, of course, we're seeing women being punished in all sorts of ways within the medical system, right? I mean, I think everybody has seen the headlines about women who are having miscarriages who need to cross state lines to seek medical care. You know, women who've been told that their pregnancies are non-viable, but that the hospitals where they live kind of can't do anything until they go into labor, or until, you know, their lives or until they are in imminent danger of the loss of a major bodily function, as some of the language of some of these statutes says. And what you're and you know, it would be easy enough if this was not what these lawmakers had in mind to change these laws, because these laws are not popular. They're not really good for the movement. They are the kind of things that if they were an unintended consequence, you would think that there would be a rush to clarify them. There is not a rush to clarify them. Instead, what you're seeing, I think, beneath the surface on the right is a kind of growing willingness to say that women must sacrifice themselves. Idaho's Republican Party recently rejected language from its party platform that would allow for abortions when a pregnant woman's life is at stake. You know, they said that, no, we're not going to have that exception. Earlier this year, the Biden administration released guidance that under federal law, hospitals have to provide abortions when they're necessarily to stabilize a patient suffering a medical emergency. You know, Texas is suing to reverse that guidance. A state representative in Arizona introduced legislation that would have made it clear that women who have abortions can be prosecuted for homicide, saying that these people deserve to, quote, spend some time in the Arizona penal system. And if you read the right-wing press, and I try to keep abreast of it as best I can, I think you're seeing a sort of growing recognition that this idea that kind of women are really the victims of abortion is a political fiction that they only really have to sustain as long as they're not in power. There's a magazine called Compact, which is, I think, you know, useful to read if you want to kind of keep abreast of the zeitgeist on the right. It's kind of a horseshoe theory journal. It's where the far right and some elements of the far right, of the far left meet. I mean, or at least the kind of elements of the far left that would have celebrated Tulsi Gabbard in the past. And what you see in this magazine is, as in much of the right, you know, sort of a growing rejection of, you know, not just kind of liberalism in the American sense, but liberalism in the Western sense. You know, liberalism meaning separation of powers, meaning fundamental human rights, meaning, you know, kind of empiricism, individualism, you know, all the things that a lot of us were taught were foundational to our society. It's, you know, one of these kind of, it's a post-liberal journal. And one of the founders of Compact wrote in another journal, the Catholic magazine First Things, recently this article called The Wrongs of Women. If you know your Mary Wollstonecraft, you probably know what that's a takeoff on. And the idea was that the anti-abortion movement needs to disabuse itself of its feminism. The anti-abortion movement is too sentimental about women's innocence. Feminism, insofar as it insists on the purity of women and the depravity of men, participates in this process. It tends toward the creation of new hierarchies, one that may prove to be less bearable than the old. You know, it's bearable to who is the question. But, you know, those old hierarchies are what this movement wants to restore. I'm going to quote from one other right-wing publication, because there was an article in a publication called The Federalist. Again, this is not something I usually say. I don't usually tell people to read The Federalist. But this article in The Federalist was, I think, important if you want to kind of understand the thinking that's animating so much of the modern right. They basically said that the conservatives need to abandon conservatism. They need to be frank about the fact that they're not really trying to conserve anything. For this quote, for starters, they should stop thinking of themselves as conservatives, much less as Republicans, and start thinking of themselves as radicals, restorations, and counter-revolutionaries. The left will only stop when conservatives stop them, which means conservatives will have to discard outdated and irrelevant notions about small government. The government will have to become, in the hands of conservatives, an instrument of renewal in American life, and in some cases, a blunt instrument indeed. Now, the problem with this vision is that women can still vote, and even though not all women are liberal, majorities of women do not want to live under a regime like this. We saw this in Kansas. I spoke to organizers of the Kansas referendum about whether or not to overturn basically their own state-level version of Roe versus Wade, and they were hopeful that they would eke it out. But there were a lot of things working against them. It's Kansas. A majority of people in Kansas approved of the Dobbs decision. At least polls showed that a majority approved of the Dobbs decision. The ballot referendum was put on in a primary election instead of the general election, where usually with a more conservative electorate. And, you all remember what happened, right? It was a stunning result. It was, I believe, 67%. They sent this message, that when these questions are put directly to the people do not want to live in the world that the far right is trying to create. And it's not just in Kansas, of course, that you've seen results like this. In Mississippi, in 2011, the voters rejected a constitutional amendment defining a fertilized egg as a person by 17 percentage points. South Dakota voters overturned a strict abortion ban by 11 points. People don't want to live under these laws. It doesn't always determine their votes, and we're going to see, I guess, in 2 weeks whether or not just how determinative it is in the midterm. People are cross-pressured in all different ways. When you put these questions to people directly, they are sort of very clear about the freedoms that they don't want to part with. But of course, the right doesn't want to. So, one way that you could interpret these results are that you have to be more responsive to the voters. Another way that you can interpret these results is that you have to make sure that different kinds of people are allowed to vote. And so I think that's what you're seeing all around the country, and this is where the two strains of kind of anti-feminism and authoritarianism intersect, because anti-feminism is both this motivating passion for a lot of authoritarian movements, but it's also a kind of a pragmatic prerogative. If people can vote, if people do vote, if people have proportional representation, this will not stand. But people don't necessarily, even in this country, as kind of as democracy has been squeezed by minority rule, both by kind of gerrymandering, by the counter-majoritarian institutions that in a time of geographic polarization are making people who live in cities, kind of more and more politically disenfranchised. The way that the right can kind of maintain power is to attack democracy at the root. I mean, one place to look at this is Wisconsin, right? Wisconsin, has a Democratic governor. It's a very closely divided state in a lot of ways. But Wisconsin also has a 1849 abortion ban that they haven't kind of worked out yet whether or not it's going to go back into effect. And so they've stopped performing abortions in that state in the meantime while it's litigated. Now, the people in Wisconsin don't necessarily want this, but the Republicans in the legislature have such an overwhelming majority that the people don't really have any plausible way of repealing this law from 1849, that they do not want to go into effect. A University of Wisconsin law school analysis found, because of the way Wisconsin maps are drawn, that if Democrats and Republicans got the same number of votes, Republicans would win 64.8% of state Senate seats and Democrats around 35.2%. And so you look at kind of similar efforts to restrict the power of voters who would kind of stand against this right-wing project, and you see that the kind of fight for women's rights in this country and the fight for preserving democracy in this country are completely intertwined. Now, I want to return for a minute to where I began, which was with the protest movement that we saw when Donald Trump was elected. And that wasn't just, it wasn't just in the United States that you saw women kind of leading the charge against authoritarianism, that you saw women leading the charge against right-wing populism. There's two scholars at Harvard, Erica Chenoweth and Zoe Marks, who have found that when mass movements have a lot of female participation, they're more likely to succeed for a host of different reasons. They have more legitimacy, they have just kind of numerically a broader base, they're less likely to become violent, which means that they're more likely to retain popular support. But they also found that these kinds of movements, not just here but globally, inspire really fierce backlashes. And I'm just going to read a quote from an article that they wrote called "Revenge of the Patriarchs: Why Autocrats Fear Women." It says, incumbent regimes that stamp out inclusive mass movements tend to indulge in a state-sponsored patriarchal backlash. The greater the proportion of women in the defeated movement, the higher the degree of a patriarchal backlash, a dynamic that has ominous implications for Afghanistan, Belarus, Colombia, Hong Kong, Lebanon, Myanmar, Russia, Sudan, and Venezuela, all of which currently have inclusive people power movements whose outcomes are uncertain. Our research shows that when countries with failed popular movements tend to experience major backsliding in both egalitarian democracy and gender equality, making them worse than before the movements began. So I would argue that this dynamic has extremely ominous implications for America as well. And with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. I have so many questions, and I'll actually ask one and not just comment. Okay. So when you talk about these movements in which women are seen with a benevolent sexism, right, and the protection of motherhood and so on, how do we square that with the ways that Black women are viewed in that type of discussion when Black women are the ones who lead most of the democratic civil society movements in the United States with the most impact?
Well, I think that the key is kind of certain women, right? There are kind of certain women that are within the circle of protection, and that has, part of kind of who is within the circle of protection is about, motherhood and ideology, but part of that has always been about race, right? I mean, sort of Black women have never been kind of, the kind of quote-unquote angel of the house, right? They've never been, society's never organized itself to kind of like spare them the brutalities of the workplace, the way, Betty Friedan would write about in The Feminine Mystique, this kind of idea of, the idea that kind of women should be tucked away at home, finding ways to fulfill themselves. It was just never something on offer for the vast majority of Black women. And so I think that, so this has obviously always been raced, but then you also, I think that even beyond that, the separation of kind of good women who deserve society's protection and women who don't, part of that is about race, but part of that is also about your sort of willingness to prop up the existing order.
Now what?
So here's, I feel a little bad because people, I know that there's a lot of frustration out there with kind of quote unquote like vote harder, because, people, they have voted harder, and yet this threat, keeps building and building and building. I do think that, especially here in Oregon, when I was originally planning this trip, I didn't think that there would be really any political reporting for me to do in Oregon, because I didn't imagine that that there was going to be kind of particularly contentious races here. But, as you may know, you guys have your own personal Herschel Walker, just, one district over. There's a guy named Mike Erickson running in Oregon 6th District, Oregon 5th, 6th District, who, also allegedly, according to reporting, paid for an ex-girlfriend's abortion, now says that abortion should be illegal, and seems to have a chance of winning a seat that Biden carried by quite a bit. And so, what happens in 2 weeks is going to either tell the country that the Dobbs decision and the kind of, insults against women's personhood that have followed it have pushed people too far, or they're going to tell the country that, kind of in a time when there's so much other like chaos and instability, there is no price to be paid for the right's extremism.
So when you mentioned that you've traveled to different countries, I'm wondering if you ever interacted with like women of color or Black women, heard of their experiences. And I would also like to ask, when you say certain women, do you not feel comfortable saying white women are like most like the ones who are protected?
Yeah, I think it's white women, but I don't think it's all white women, right? I mean, I think white women kind of start with maybe a presumption of protection, but when I say, so I think it's, look, there's obviously, there's obviously a presumption of kind of defense of whiteness when you talk about the, the kind of housewife or the, angelic mother. That's always been racially coded. The only reason I say certain women is because women who don't have children, women who strive for power for their own sake, as opposed to, kind of quote unquote, as mothers. There's a lot of ways, I think, to fall out of the circle of protection. As for your other question, yeah, I mean, I did a lot of reporting for my second book in Kenya, in Ethiopia, in Uganda. And, I think what you see in those countries, where obviously it's not not necessarily, it's not really racial conflicts but what you see in those countries, especially when I was reporting on this, in Ethiopia, for example, unsafe abortion was a major cause of maternal mortality. When you would go to, hospitals in Addis Ababa, the maternity wards were just filled with women who had septic abortions. This was sort of before, a few years before there was widespread access to abortion pills. And the Ethiopian government, which had a very strict abortion ban, wanted to change that because it was, partly because it was cruel and partly because it was just like resource intensive to, it was like a strain on their healthcare system. And you saw a lot of pressure from Republicans in the United States not to do that. And so, the debate, I think, about kind of international institutions and women's rights in Africa is really complicated because you have international kind of meddling on both sides, and you have local people and local groups trying to use the international systems to their advantage. So you would have, this is something I saw a lot in Kenya around female genital cutting, where there were women who wanted kind of greater sanctions on this practice, and they didn't have that much access to power in their own country. But what they did have access to was kind of feminists, often, but not entirely white feminists, but feminists at international conferences who could then in turn put pressure on their government to put pressure on the Kenyan government to make it act. And so it's a very kind of circuitous and somewhat anti-democratic system, but people, work with what they have.
Thanks. That's all I had to say. I'm not saying that, of course white women aren't affected by misogyny because they are ultimately women, but it's like, at the end of the day, the law does, place them above other women, and ultimately it's black women who are, dying at higher rates.
I think that that's right. But the only thing, I also think that there's been language among some of the social justice left that basically says, well, rich white women are always going to be able to get abortions, and that this is going to fundamentally affect women of color and kind of poor women of color the most severely. And you're right that we have, kind of a black maternal mortality crisis in this country that would be treated as much more of a national emergency if white women were dying at similar rates. Where I think that language is not helpful is, well, two reasons. First of all, it's not, I don't think it's true. I think that white women will always have easier access to abortion. They'll always have easier access to reproductive care. But actually, almost nobody is totally outside of, almost nobody gets exempted from this. And if you look at, say, some of the women who've had to cross state lines to end their pregnancies, it's not just that they're white women, but these are white Christian women who wanted to be mothers, and they don't get exempted from these laws and these policies. and I also just think that the country being what it is, I don't think that the message to that the message you white women don't have to worry about this for yourselves and your daughters, I don't think it's politically a good one.
Yeah, I do agree. I think that oftentimes people, I think it's easier for people to understand race a lot more easier than misogyny and things like that, because misogyny is so deeply ingrained. And I do agree with you that of course there's white women who are stuck in conservative abusive relationships that wouldn't be able to get an abortion. I do recognize that, definitely.
Right, or not even abusive relationships. Women who, pregnancies go wrong all the time. And the one thing that I feel I've seen in, reporting on this stuff all over the world is the line between, there is no line between kind of women who want to become mothers and women who want to have abortions. It's the same women. And, kind of anybody can find themselves in that situation.
Sort of a takeoff on the what next. Where is there hope? And I'm at least entertaining the fantasy that if things go what I would consider badly in this election, that the true colors would come out. They would be doing things that are so extreme that maybe in 2024 we would see a turnaround. Where do you see the future, and do these autocratic governments, are they durable? I mean, are we likely to see this happen here and be there for a really long time?
So, this new version of right-wing populism is still, I think, kind of new enough that it's difficult to say, how long do they endure, right? Like, how long is Orbanism going to endure in Hungary, or how long is Putinism going to endure in Russia? I can't say. I mean, I think, look, I always find the kind of, I find, maintaining hope, maintaining optimism, like really a personal challenge in the work that I do. It kind of creates a lot of despair, but I do think it's like really worth remembering that people do have agency in all of this. People were able first in 2018 and then in 2020 to stop this from happening. And there are, just around here, there are like a lot of races where, the outcome is not preordained and where people have the power to turn things around. The other thing I would say, and I mean, I don't think that this is a cause for hope, but I do think that with regards to abortion specifically, the regime that they are going to impose is so unpopular and is so, you kind of can't hide it, right? Like, people are going to understand what's happening. They're going to, kind of have to take this into account when they make decisions about their own lives. And I don't think it's sustainable. I don't think it can be sustained. But, I think people feel not just, people feel like a lot of despair. They feel a lot of frustration, which I understand. They feel traumatized by COVID. They feel, I've heard in this city, people feel, a sense of kind of loss of Portland as they once knew it. And, part of the question, I think, is whether all of those feelings, which are super understandable, are going to, outweigh a kind of fundamental commitment to liberal democracy.
Hello.
Hello.
So you mentioned how Russia had become a figurehead for like the so-called traditional values. How do you feel that the alt-right in America has handled the similarities between their talking points of the same type of values and Russians, while also dealing with the anti-communist and anti-Russian in particular talking points that their party in America as a whole has been known for a while?
Well, I don't think that I think that, everybody sort of knows that Russia hasn't been communist for a long time. And so what I see is kind of similarities between the alt-right in America and the most kind of the most kind of willfully naive, useful idiots on the old American left during communism, where people were sort of, where Russia also set itself out as the, kind of the leader of this global ideological tendency that they were going to use to kind of ingratiate themselves to groups within all kinds of different countries all over the world. And there were people who fell for it, and I think that you're seeing something like that being replicated, but just with the ideological polarities reversed. And so, there's no anti-Russian sentiment on the alt-right. They, people love Russia. I mean, there's, Nick Fuentes, who I mentioned earlier, who is this kind of, Gen X far-right organizer. Roger Stone, an advisor to the president, has a new show on his streaming service. He's, very outwardly anti-Semitic, wants to repeal the 19th Amendment. but when he gave a speech at one of his conferences, they were all chanting like Putin, 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 and he said at one point, people compare him to Hitler, like that's a bad thing, and so, yeah, I don't think that it is. The more interesting tension, I think, that you saw in parts of the alt-right was how they reconciled their very real Islamophobia with their admiration of the Taliban, but they managed.
Thank you.
I'd like to bring this home and ask you a personal question.
Mm-hmm.
So what is, as a writer, what is the generative story? What is the pull to politics? Well, as a woman, yes, obviously, but why politics? As a writer, you can write about so many things, and you're deeply passionate about politics. So what's the story there?
So I would say a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I grew up in Buffalo, New York, where, I don't know if you remember, during the 90s, there was a group called Operation Rescue that first shut down abortion clinics in Wichita, and then our mayor at the time, who was this right-wing Democrat, invited them to Buffalo. And activists, I mean, I didn't really know anything about politics, but I knew I was furious about this. And activists organized and physically kept the clinics open. They went out early in the morning and linked arms, and the operation, it was like this really demented game of Red Rover, where the anti-abortion people would throw themselves at the lines, and then when someone wanted to come into the clinic, they would let them in. And that was an amazing introduction to politics, because usually in politics you don't win in a day, and so to basically be able to do something so tangible was really powerful to me. And then why I don't know if I can answer the question of why I've taken breaks from politics. I wrote a book about how yoga came to the West. But there is, I guess, I'm kind of an ideological person. I've always been really interested in mass movements, and there's still so many things out there that are surprising, which is kind of the way that I keep myself going, because I do feel a lot of despair, is to try to just be curious about things, and so, which allows me, I think, to keep a little bit of distance from them.
Okay, thanks.
So maybe to provide just the tiniest antidote for that despair, I'm happy to say that my 26-year-old daughter, by her own account, has not experienced nearly, if any, of the sexism that I did when I was a young engineer in the late 80s, early 90s. And so my question is, do you see any meaningful difference between young and old on the right? Am I wrong to hope that most of the fervor for taking us back to that old order comes from those who are old enough to remember it?
You mean well, look, I think things are better along a lot of axes, certainly, and I think that young women are, I would like to hope, not going to tolerate going back in time. I do think that there is a huge amount of misogyny among young men, and sort of, not all young men, obviously, but I think that there's a sort of significant contingent of misogynist young men who, I earlier talked about the distinction between hostile sexism and benevolent sexism. If you spend any time in kind of the alt-right, it's just hostile sexism. And you see this in polling, not just in this country, but around the world, that among a lot of young men, because the thing is that young men are actually not doing very well. What we have in this country is a very strange, it's not just in this country, You have men falling behind by a lot of measures. You know, men do much worse in school, and that's not just limited to America. I mean, you have more women in college than men in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, and most countries in the world. You know, but you have in this country where, you know, your prospects often, if you don't go to college, are kind of bleak. You have men, you know, more likely, you know, especially single men, more likely to die of drug overdoses, you know, more likely to be victims of, you know, certainly more likely to end up in prison, more likely to be, I think, victims as well as perpetrators of gun violence. And so I think a lot of you, and yet you also have men in charge, you know, in sort of all of these areas where you still, you know, where men still have a kind of a lock on power. And so the idea that kind of the idea that kind of the patriarchy still exists, they both don't see it in their own, I think there are a lot of young men who just both don't see it in their own lives, or in as much as they recognize it, it seems like aspirational. You know, and there's, I think, some kind of ways in which young men and young women are growing apart as, you know, marriage rates go down and, you know, sex, you know, the number of people having sex declines, and sort of all sorts of kind of, you know, gender relations in general are just not great among young people. So I don't necessarily think that we can like rest easy when the people who want to restore some kind of like prelapsarian, you know, 50s world to just like die off. But I do think that, you know, among young women in particular, there is, I think, a much stronger commitment to preserving rights that they thought they could take for granted than, you know, in polling, like young women kind of consistently say that, you know, abortion is one of the most important issues facing this country, which other people don't say in polling. And so, you know, I don't think that people are going to kind of give up these rights without a fight.
Hi. This might be a broad question, but in your professional opinion, what do you think will be the breaking point for the Republican Party? Like over the past few years, we've seen that they will lower their standards faster than they can violate them. But what do you think will be the point where the cognitive dissonance just won't work anymore and maybe some people will wake up?
I think only if they lose. I mean, I don't think it has anything to do with like, you know, I think people have been waiting for years and years for there to be a moment where people say, this is too far, you know. They thought it with the Access Hollywood tape. They thought it with, you know, January 6th. They thought it with Marjorie Taylor Greene. They thought it with, you know, Herschel Walker, who I started talking about. It's not going to be that. What will make them say that is losing and basically saying, you know, kind of this isn't working for us, and we, you know, we want power. We have not been able to change the system so that we can achieve power without winning over a majority of the voters, and so we need to, you know, we sort of need to give up a political style that that repels so many people, but it's only going to be losing.
Thank you.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Good evening, Michelle.
Hi.
I am Chris Lidiasis from Philippines. So I am here for a cultural exchange program of U.S. Department of State representing Philippines. And with me is my fellows from Indonesia, Fanny and Risa from Cambodia. So I am here speaking in front of you as a young transgender woman and a youth accountability panelist member of She Decides. It's a global movement for sexual health rights, bodily autonomy, and gender equality. This question is personally coming from me, and I asked you personally for this. The force of internalized sexism can be hard to see. What do you suggest for calling out and disrupting everyday instances of patriarchy and misogyny? And second question, sorry.
That's okay.
What do you say to people who don't see gender inequality as a pressing issue of our time?
So I think, okay, so the first one, I think that the left tends to spend too much time on sort of political psychoanalysis. You know, I mean, I think that people that we all have our kind of internal biases, that we all have our blind spots and presuppositions and like outdated frameworks for seeing the world, and that you can spend too much time thinking that you need to kind of change yourself before you can kind of act effectively in the world. And, you know, and then also you see that, I think, in organizations. I think as people feel a lot of despair about their ability to be effective in creating broader change, they turn inwards. You know, it's why you have like huge amounts of infighting in feminist organizations and left-wing organizations. You know, a lot of them are becoming kind of unmanageable as people just like turn their political energy inwards. I mean, my kind of old-fashioned sense is that you change your perceptions through the work you do and through activism. And this is actually a lesson that I think we can learn from the anti-abortion movement. The anti-abortion movement is really good at welcoming people in who aren't totally on board with the whole program, but maybe they have some questions about abortion. Maybe there's research that shows that the kind of biggest predictor of somebody becoming an anti-abortion activist is not their personal feelings about abortion, but whether a friend or relative or something brought them to an anti-abortion event, and they, you know, it's kind of through the activism that they internalize this whole worldview. And so that's, I mean, I think that people, you know, rather than kind of worrying over much about people's internalized sexism, it just makes more, I think you kind of, you get over that by, I don't know if you ever really get over it, but in as much as you can, I think the best way to address it is to try to act in the world at large. As for what I say to people, I mean, I think it's different sorts of people who say that gender equality isn't a problem, right? There's people who say gender equality isn't desirable, and I don't know that I have that much to say to them. But there are other people who say that gender equality has been achieved. And those people, I think, you can speak to, and some of them, and one way you can speak to them is to try to acknowledge, as I did earlier, that, you know, like I said, things are bad for young men, and there's a lot of people who are sort of right to feel like, well, I don't feel privileged, I don't feel advantaged, and that, you know, sort of a system in which kind of things are really bad for the majority of men can still coexist with, you know, a kind of patriarchal system in which a minority of men hold all the power.
Thank you.
So my question is a little more on the autocracy side. Can the US become more equally representative in our current system? And do we need substantial changes to limit the outsized electoral power of a relatively small popular far right?
Okay, well, those are two very different questions, right? Because it's like, do we need them and can we have them are two very different things, like, right? So yes, we need them. Can we have them? I mean, in a sense, you know, the Constitution, there's a sort of, it's like, you can see it as, it's almost a prison in certain ways, even though there's, you know, much in it to revere, because it makes itself so incredibly difficult to change. And so, you know, if it were up to me, we would, you know, abolish the Senate, but we're not going to abolish the Senate. But there, you know, and so I don't think that you're ever going to have a system in which the kind of counter-majoritarian elements of politics are gone. But there are things that can be done to make them less severe, for sure. I mean, you know, you can change the number. It's much easier to change the number of states than the existence of the Senate, you know, so I wish that there had been, I'm not sure how much the administration could have done on statehood for Washington, D.C., you know, statehood if they want it for Puerto Rico. But there, you know, I think those are priorities. Multi-member districts would, I think, make the House both much more responsive to people and much more functional, because you would basically have some representation for, you know, conservatives in very blue areas and liberals in very red areas. And you know, ranked choice voting, which would, you know, it would certainly eliminate it would likely eliminate the kind of spoiler effect that you could end up seeing in this election.
Thank you.
Thank you.